Bam.
This is John Spencer, and you're watching the Break It Down show.
I love what I get to do. I love that I get to meet all these great new people. You're one of them. We've known each other for several years now. You write about urban warfare quite a lot. By the way, everybody should get your book. I'll put the link up here in a sec. But I guess the main thing is to understand that we have the ability nowadays to have a conflict like the Ukraine-Russian war, and people like you can go there and actually go look, and you're not an embedded reporter, you're an actual expert in the field, and you could bring us the actual knowledge that we have. You and I both know embedded reporters are wonderful to have them there, but they rarely get the story. They get their story, and it's often like, hey, you missed all of the good things that you could have been talking about. Now Kaj Larson, there's all kinds of guys that go out, and you guys can see the battlefield in a way that nobody else can.
Yeah, well, I appreciate that, and I agree that um, in a conflict like in war, you need embedded journalists. But like you said, each journalist brings his own lens to the conflict. I mean, they're experts in different things. Or I look at it as a soldier and as a researcher, and I have a dream job where I can go into conflicts that military people can't. And it's actually, and I know you'll appreciate this from Afghanistan and things. We used to have a very vibrant combat observer program in the military, in the U.S. military, where we'd send officers around the world and embed them in conflicts that aren't ours, just to observe the evolutions and both the character of warfare and the context of the war itself, whether it's China-Japan war, or we used to have a really big program. For political reasons, we don't. So, and this is one of the reasons, as you know, we stood up the Modern War Institute at West Point, is because the actual coverage of war, like live war, like modern war, is left to the journalist who have it. It's a for-profit business. They have to create a story.
Yeah.
And there are some, ones like Sebastian Younger and those that are out there for different reasons and bring us different stories. But yeah, I can go in, and I'm coming in with my urban warfare lens, trying to see how that's playing out in the first peer-on-peer conflict since World War II.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's amazing.
One of the things I noticed that the early on coverage were the embedded reporters. And again, God bless, this is a really hard job, but they didn't know outgoing versus incoming. So they're jumping in. You're like, you can hear on TV, you're like, that's outgoing. So this is the difference between someone who's seasoned, who's been shot at, who's been, blown up, who understands the pieces at a multidimensional level. You have clarity that can't be provided reliably from an ABC embed reporter.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say all of them, right, Pete? There's a few that
Yeah.
have combat experience, but yeah, generally it's so hard, and then we see it, and like we can see what's going on, or even have more questions that they're not asking,
Right.
or see this. And I've had, as you know, amazing last year where I've been asked by most of the broadcast channels to provide my analysis. And I would also argue, as you understand, that my ability to go there, like I even feel bad sometimes when I haven't been on the ground for a long time and I'm providing
Yeah.
analysis, because if you're not there, it's really hard. Even if you're okay, the journalist is there, but he doesn't have the military expertise. Well, then you have military experts here providing expertise, and they've never been there.
Yeah.
So it is, it's catch-22, but you have to look at these things through so many different lenses. And so many different angles, like you do on the show, to bring different experts to look at it, because there is no one person who understands what's going
Oh,
on.
yeah. I mean, I'll have my mind blown. I'm trying to get him back on the show now, but Yuri Raitasalo, I think he's now a general in the Finnish army, teaches at the War College, right? You talk to him about all of this stuff, and he says incredible things. Like he one time said to me, there are many Europes. Blew my mind. And he's totally right. We think of Europe as being one thing, but Europe isn't even the size of the United States, and look how different Florida is from Alaska.
Yeah.
I mean, oh my
Yeah.
God.
And that's every time I go to Ukraine, man, I was trying to explain to somebody, like, it's not Texas, but from you try to drive across Texas or Georgia, and you're like, this is never ending. Well, Ukraine is, I mean, just going from like a little movement on the map, and like that's an 8-hour drive, or it's the second largest country in Europe, but it's massive, and so that's why when we see these maps of things on the, we see these war maps, and even Eastern Ukraine, you're
Yeah.
talking about Georgia and Texas combined between those two units.
Another thing we lose sight of is how close everything is in Europe, right? Like, yes, Ukraine and driving across, especially in a combat environment, is. I mean, you and I both know what would be a 15-minute drive in a civilian vehicle in an MRAP is an hour. Like it just takes forever. On the other side, Paris is, I don't know, off the top of my head right now, I can't remember, but 1,200 miles maybe from Kiev. And so these places are close, and you're talking about this thing cascading into Prague or any of these other places. I mean, Poland is right there, and they're itching for it. So you have this proximity as well on an international scale.
Yeah, absolutely. And I just did a presentation to, I get to go around the world too and talk to military units, trying to tell them what I see, how the things that are applicable to them. And I just gave a presentation here at Fort Carson to a unit who had just come back from a mission in Lithuania, where they're on the border, and realizing how close they are to this. It's fascinating to understand, like, they were there.
Yeah, yeah. You were there. You were there this last week.
I was, and had another amazing. I mean, we talked last time after I got back. I was there in July of last year.
Yeah,
I went back, and it's like there's so many differences, even in that time frame. Even in what I was looking at, right? So I'm looking at trying to piece together the story of the Battle of Kiev that happened, last February, ended in April. But I think it's such an iconic story, in that this is the challenge, as as somebody who studies military history. Usually the story comes out 20 years from now.
yeah,
I'm trying to piece together this one battle. You think it would be kind of easy, but it was so massive, but it's so important to the history of war, that I keep going back, and that's why I went back last week to continue to close the gaps in my understanding of what happened, and then to be able to tell a story. And again, not as many people as that I talk to as you, Pete, understand. Like, look, some people want to do numbers and all that stuff, but human nature is
oh boy,
storytelling, and you have to be able to tell a story of what happened there. Uh,
yeah.
so I gave a presentation in Ukraine, which was surreal. Is they asked me to give a presentation in Ukraine to Ukrainians on the Battle of Kiev in Kiev, and many of the people in the room had been there, had fought there. So that's the first time, one of the first times, not that I've actually given a presentation like that, to a group of people who were already there, and and give me the feedback of, like, I had no idea, because whether you're in a village in Afghanistan or in Baghdad, you really can't zoom up and understand what's going on
That's
all
right.
over, even in one city. And that's what my mission is right now, and I'm trying to close these gaps and to be able to piece together this one battle. As I follow Ukraine daily, but I want to be
Yeah.
able to tell that story as part of my profession.
And even if there were three other yous, you all wouldn't agree on a lot. There'd be plenty of things you agree on of these dates, these times, but the impacts and all these other things, it's very confusing to understand that. And it's such a great point. When you're in the moment, when you're in that village, when you're working in this district, and you just can't. And I would often say to the commander, like, I'm going to get things wrong because I'm the pinpoint on the map. You're going to have to twist and adjust and lift and whatever, so that I can see what I need to see, because you're so narrowly focused. And I was wondering, I guess I have two questions here. One of them is how long does it take, or do you even get to the point where you start to actually see and understand what you're seeing? Or is the whole time it's just like a load of information in, and then it slowly parses itself out once you come back? Or how does that work? When do you start to see, and how do you process it, I guess is my question.
No, that's a great question, and I've actually gotten it a few times, about how do I approach writing these things, these case studies that me and my friend, Jason Drew, write, where we're trying to take some big, massive, complex fog of war and then write it into comprehensible story, in a short story at that. So I start by trying to find out just chronologically what happened in a battle. So just day one to when it ends, and
Right.
then pick out, because when you're talking about, like, whether it's a battle of Stalingrad where you have a million person army fighting another million person army, or like the Battle of Kiev where you have, you know, tens of thousands of people doing things at the same time, but identify the key moments,
Yeah.
because there are moments that matter more. So then, it's almost like it actually is like any story, uh, actually, follows a path, and I learned this through writing, whether it's a book or an article, there's a path. So you have to identify the key moments, the key acts in the play, whatever it is. And then I drill down. So that's what I did last visit, where I went to Bucha, I went to Irpin, I went to Bravary, I went up to near Chernobyl, trying to identify the settings of the key acts of the play, of the story. And then I drill down to, all the great reporting that's been done on it. If I could, take Bucha, like, because that's kind of familiar to everybody because it hits so much news. And then I drill down into that. Like, I want to be able to tell that moment in the play really well. So I go there and I talk to fighters on the ground. I talk to the general who was directing things. I talk to the volunteers that were there. And so when I go to tell the story, like in a presentation or a writing, I can say, hey, these are the key moments in this battle where it could have turned. And that's human nature. Like, we're one moment,
Right.
whether it's the drive to Baghdad in 2003, and key moments, key actors, and then I piece that together. But I have to drill in and I have to drill out depending on how I want to tell the story. You always try to get the numbers, right? Because some historians or analysts want the numbers, right?
Right.
How big was the attacker? How big was the defender? How many bullets and beans? And you try to weave that in there. This is why I love my job, and it's a dream job. It's really a science and and an art to be able to take that out. And as you know, and as you do every day, is I'm also looking for a different so what. Like, look, I'm going to tell a story, right? And I could write a book, and a lot of people are asking after this last visit, like, when's the book of the Battle of Kiev coming out? Uh, TBD. But I,
Yeah.
the military, who calls often, also wants, what's the lesson? Like, what's the so what, that you're taking
Yeah.
out of this? And there's so many, but I try to pull out, okay, depending on what audience I'm talking to. Like, I was in Italy right before going to Ukraine, talking to my old unit. It's an airborne unit who does airfield seizures and things like that. So I want to be able to pull out a lesson from a key moment to say, look, this is what happened, good and bad, and what you should take from this. And hopefully all militaries around the world are doing this. Like, look, this is what happened here. What's the so what to us? And should we change the things we're doing, the equipment we have, the plans? And that, again, that's the dream job that I do.
Yeah. And there are so many questions just within that. You know, the gods of war, boy, they don't abide confidence and preparation at all. They like, yeah, that's you all are adorable. You can just envision some German general pointing like, go this way, and then whack, he's dead. And like, he is the key guy because his cousin was the guy that did, and then it all falls apart. And then maybe you get it back together, but there's these things where the wrong person at the wrong action at the wrong time, and it's just bad luck.
Yeah,
And it impacts wars, especially for Russia with their, you and I both know, like when they came in, they don't, what we do better than anybody else is we can move stuff. We can lubricate things. We can keep rubber on parts that need rubber on them. Nobody else does that at the scale and size and success level that we do. That's a big impact. What are some of those key moments in the Battle of Kiev that turned things? Because it wasn't, I mean, when it was happening, it was like, this is not going to go well for Kiev.
absolutely. And actually, I talked to some reporters on my trip last week, because there are now, New York Times and others who have field offices in Ukraine, and they said, after talking to me, that their thoughts about the war, the battle actually had for over a year had not been what I was saying. That that
Mm,
where I say Russia had a very strong chance at succeeding in their objective in the battle and raising the Russian flag over Kiev, and really would be a different war would be being fought today had they had that success. And it came down to human, like you said, human nature of bad luck.
yeah,
What Clausewitz would say, chance, the fog, the friction, and really the chance of war. Good militaries have amazing, leaders that look. It's not going to go the way you want. There's all kinds of whether you call it Murphy or just bad luck that's going to happen, and it's the military who has a leader development and trust and all these things that adapt, and that's the
yeah,
history of Custer or Gettysburg. Like it's humans reacting to the luck,
yeah,
good and bad, of war, whether they had the ability to adapt like resources and things, but it really come and that's really the Battle of Kiev. I mean, most people will think that the first real moment is the airfield seizure in Hostomel, which is one of the major airports outside of or in Kiev, right? An international type of airport. But actually before that, there's this giant, massive years in preparation intelligence operation where Russian FSB had invested a great amount of money in sleeper cells, traders, investing in buying buildings, and all of these things where they were going to take down the city from within. And they have done that before. Whether you think the Little Green Men of 2014, Special Forces in civilian clothes, all of this, and that was absolutely present in Kiev, and it was just from really, an intense intelligence operation, counterintelligence operation, and in this visit, I got to talk to a lot of Ukrainian police generals who are strongly involved and had lots of pictures, which were probably not for me, on how they took down these sleeper cells that were going to take down Kyiv from within. And you'll probably understand that some of that involved, signals intelligence and things like
oh
that.
yeah,
So the raids that they were doing, which were very reminiscent of the types of things that we were doing in Baghdad, where you find cell phones, you do raids, you find key people. They were doing that at scale and capturing people in Kyiv who were planning to take the city down from within. They had a list of politicians they were going to take out. They had a list of buildings to attack, and that was picked apart by really. And this is the part of Ukraine that I've had to learn about how Ukraine had changed itself and was reorganizing itself from all the different institutions after 2014 through with a lot of external help. And most people focus on the military, right? The military was in 2014 and NATO and US and Canadian involvement in trying to rebuild the Ukrainian military to be something um, to what would be the stepping stone of what it becomes now. Well, you can say the same thing with the police. After the Maidan Revolution, the police get completely cleaned out,
yeah.
completely reorganized, and again, I study urban warfare, and I know that you understand these things and talking in the past. Like cities are worlds into themselves.
Oh, this, there's conflict all through a city, right? Like there's criminal, there's political, there's military. Oh my God. When you started talking about the intel side of this thing, man, like my counterintelligence heart just warmed up. We get to talk about my shit for a second here. But when you have an asset on the ground, right, and they're doing intelligence, counterintelligence, but they're actively doing human stuff, they are so exposed. The amount of time it takes to protect yourself, to cover your tracks, you're supposed to simultaneously be known to everybody so that you're a resource to your command, but also be hidden in plain sight. Oh, it's such a crazy thing. And so the more you activate these dudes,
Yep.
the more they're going to be exposed and be compromised. And also, by the way, it's extremely hard to reliably create a like let's say there is no ranger school for counterintelligence. It's all just sort of like, I'm going to try this. And then you go out and you do it. There's no tabs, there's no tridents, none of that. You just have to go out day to day and try to do your job. And so you're going to get some guys that are going to be great at it. You're going to get some guys going to be bad at it, and they're all enmeshed. And so if you get a C minus grade counterintelligence agent who gets popped, who gets stung because of their inability to protect themselves, or they're a little lethargic in their efforts, that compromises that whole CI network, right? And if you just have bad luck and you're an A plus plus guy, like me, like my super seals, one thing happens, one person catches my eye, and that's it, changes everything, and your network just degrades like crazy, and then gets flipped on you, and you get double and triple agent ops going on, and oh my god, it gets to be crazy. So thanks for letting me get the chance to talk about
No,
counterintelligence for a
absolutely.
second.
And that's the thing, you can't understand a military operation without understanding that all that's going on with the intelligence, counterintelligence operations. And to be very like, I don't mind bashing Russians on a daily basis,
Yeah,
but you have to give Russians credit for all the work that they did planning their operation. I mean, they had informants, they had traders, they had years of intelligence work on what equipment is where and
yeah,
what to strike, right? Because once a military operation starts, it relies on intelligence from the ground.
yeah,
And you send that intelligence, claim plainclothes people to go gather everything.
everything,
Uh,
everything. Yeah,
so you can't start to understand the battle of Key without understanding all that's going on before the first Russian military vehicle crosses Ukrainian airspace or a ground movement.
right. And then the process gets faster once the battle starts, and it's even more desperate to get the information at the expense of the agent, and you quickly lose agents because
Yeah,
like,
that's like you said. You actually keyed me when you said, once you activate those, and that's like like the spotlights that get turned on once you start the operation and you activate all that.
mhm,
Well, based on this last bit of research I did, like that was one of the key moments. Like once I activated, because now there's just red lights all over the map on.
oh,
Like that's weird that those cell phone numbers and this is
mhm,
happening. And you have to respond to that quickly, and that's what happened. Like all those red lights started turning on, like and just some very initiative driven people, like what the heck, and started immediately responding to it. Not which is one of the failures in the Russian system. If you have this, I got to report that, I got to wait for a commander to make a decision. When you have, and we all know this in like leadership, when you have trusted people that also have the authority, right? That's the whole thing about being a profession is the citizens and the
yeah,
government have given you authority. So now you have people that have the information who also have the initiative and authority to start doing raids and things like that to stop all this stuff from happening and really just stop the wheels from turning by putting like, oh, that just fell out. Like
yep,
you understand uh, why things start to go, you change the luck for the other side when you just start picking away at the plan.
yeah, yeah. Oh boy, is there so much? I don't want to get distracted by the counterintelligence thing. I can easily do another 45 minutes with you on that alone, but I want to get off of that. One of my beliefs, but before this thing started, is that there's really this other generation. We'll just call it sixth generation, but war has been democratized. Anybody can go on Amazon and buy a drone that can carry 1,000-pound payload. Our sniper rifles are constantly shooting 2+ miles out, right? And so there's all these things. Farmers can make anything, and Ukraine is full of farmers. And so when we look at like how spread out the power of combat is, it really is off the shelf stuff is dangerous for people. I mean, if you want to get a hacker, you don't get a person who's in a uniform. You get a kid who is nowhere near a military structure, and they will destroy things. So, talk a little bit about that democratization of combat, what you've
Yeah,
seen.
absolutely. That democratization of capability, military grade capability. But when you combine that, like what we saw, civilian off the shelf capabilities, whether it's a drone, it's a camera, or it's a weapon that you just happen to have, you combine that with all the cultural aspects, right? And you've been around the world like I have, and like every piece of the world is different.
Yeah,
People got to understand that Ukraine was the military innovation of the Soviet military. It's where most of the capability, whether it's nuclear to military, comes from. It's a very educated, innovative society. So, like in the Battle of Kiev, when you have tens of thousands of very intelligent, innovative people that want to do something, then
Look
you,
out.
yeah, look out. And that's what I again learned about more of this trip was about
Yeah.
how they establish fusion intelligence fusion centers all over. They put up like massive industrial level cameras, uh, drones, and then, oh, by the way, so you have innovative, educated, motivated people, but you have a shit or a crap ton of veterans, right? So, like, even in America, people want to talk the talk, but actually, the percentage of veterans who have any combat experience who have actually held a gun is minuscule in our
Yeah.
society. So,
Right.
yeah, you think you're going to go all Red Dawn, but in Ukraine, you actually have a very high percentage in every village, in every city of military age males who have had combat experience, whether that was in Soviet army, whether that was in the 2014 post kind of reinvent themselves military. And that's so now you have literally Pete, the recipe for a really bad day in
Yeah.
Ukraine, especially in a concentrated population center like Kyiv. And this is where you see, yeah, there's a military story, right? There's a brigade, and that's it in Kyiv. But then there are tens of thousands of civilians who stand up and say, I want to help.
Hmm.
So even in which I don't want to over focus on, but it was a real part of my research, how they could see everything. And whether it was a grandma calling on a phone or a camera or that you put up or a bank
Yeah.
camera, a highway camera, and how you integrate that, and I know that that's beyond even the scale of what the US military could do is fuse that into a common operational picture to where you can divert military capabilities. They did that. They had the capability of, because one thing they had was, I asked this question like, look, I understand you could receive a bunch of information, whether it's cameras, cell phones, all this stuff, but you really got to have a person in the fusion cell who is then receiving that, validating it, prioritizing it, all this. I'm like, well, when you have hundreds of volunteers who are showing up who are, software engineers, blah, all these things like, hey, okay, sit at this terminal. You're now going to be an Intel analyst who's going to analyze stuff that's coming in and prioritize it. And oh, by the way, there was this software already developed in Ukraine, which I think surpasses even US military capabilities, who have their own challenges in procurement and DERS, all these things.
Yeah.
They had this civilian system that could integrate intelligence and then they could action it. And again, it's the innovation and every society is different. You had a motivated, innovative, capable population with now military grade capabilities. No wonder the Russians were demolished in their plan. Not to say they didn't have a chance.
Sure.
As the more I learn about it, like, holy moly, like I've never seen that concentration of capabilities. Like you said, with the democratization of whatever it
Yeah.
is,
Yeah.
technologies, a military grade equipment. If you, but even if we were to drop that in certain parts of the world, and you've seen this, like you can drop all the military equipment you want in to give it to the Taliban. That
Yeah.
doesn't mean that you just turn them into a superior military, because there are cultural things.
Right.
There's all kinds of factors, human factors,
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
factor into that.
This is such a great point because one of the things we struggle with in Afghanistan is like I was sitting in a talk and it was kind of a gotcha question. It's like, hey Pete, what's the number one TV channel they watch in this district? Because I've been working there and talking a lot, gaining a lot of influence. And I'm like, hey Dennis, they don't have electricity there, and it blew their minds because they hadn't even thought about this, right? And so like in a place like Afghanistan where I was, it was it was beyond rural and rugged. It was you couldn't move on a vehicle for long without being completely isolated and exposed, and your vehicle was likely to break. The military hated to hear that, but that was the God's honest truth, right? Now you have a completely different world in Ukraine where you have farmers who are behind the Russian lines, and just like, I'm right here. Or how about there must be so much discontent within the Russian force, and they all have cell phones. And if they can hook up to Elon Musk's, internet or anything and get that message out, oh my God, like every commander's got to be like, how in the world do I lead these people when they literally, again, they've been democratized. They can say, I'm reporting against us internally, I'm going to die anyhow. F you. Then here it goes.
And they think they're smart. So there's a lot of this, especially early in the world. The Russians thought they were smart. Like, hey, take all of the Russian soldiers' cell phones or whatever. Well, what do soldiers do? And we've talked about this in my book. Soldiers will find a way. So what do soldiers do? They take the Ukrainian's phone and they start using the Ukrainian's cell phone to talk home, to talk to themselves. Well, what does a Ukrainian do? Well, they just report to the Ukrainians that my cell phone was taken.
Yeah.
If you're a signals guy, like, oh, okay, now I have the exact number that I need to. You just went from tens of thousands of phone numbers to, I just need to track in on this one that we know has been confiscated by a Russian. And this is, which I think you'll find that. So I keep saying this, and I really believe this. What the Ukrainians have done, and I can talk specifically about the Battle of Kyiv. No other military in the world could have done that.
Wow.
There's too much area, basically city-specific information and human capability that only they could access. And whether it's, flooding their own rivers and things like that, that literally you could have dropped the best U.S. military division into Kyiv before the Russians invaded, and it would have gone a lot differently. And I don't think would have had as much success as the Ukrainians leading and activating their own people and infrastructure and cities to do what they did.
What's changed between the early Battle of Kyiv days and now? Like when you walk around, what are you seeing?
Yeah, there's a different feeling in the population for sure. And I didn't, again, because I was focused on Kyiv, but even Kyiv from July of last year to this is that one, Kyiv never shut down. Like as an urban guy, I was also asking a lot of questions, like how did it feed itself? How did it?
Yeah.
It never stopped living, because some people think that cities are living organisms. It never stopped.
Yeah.
It definitely had a different feel. Like this time, very active, curfews changing. They're refusing to cower to even Russian terrorism and there were Shahed drones landing on the city last week while I was there. Most of them got shot down, but they're as a civilization. At the first time, I think I told you I felt this overwhelming unity in the people, like we are Ukrainians, and that's in these new polls. Just fascinating that if you ask them the question, how do you identify yourself? And it isn't gender, it isn't political, it's literally, I am Ukrainian. I felt that the first time. Of course I felt it this time, but I also felt this time was just a refusal for letting Russia change their day-to-day lives. And you saw just active, posters and calls for action everywhere where they're standing up new units to fight. It's really a weird sensation and I think we talked about this, we have division in our own country everywhere. There's amazing unity there. And even as there's less burning tanks in Kyiv as my last visit, but there's actually an active feeling of we're not going to let Russia, even with their terrorism, even with what's going on, change who we are as a people. So I felt that really strongly this time as I spent a lot more time out in the actual center of the city and things.
We lose sight of how close combat is. Like it's like I'm going to go on a combat patrol. You may not see or hear a single bullet the entire time, right? So how far away is the fight from Kyiv right now?
Oh, it's that's a great question. And
Yes.
I even talked to a really fast. I'm writing an article about this one person because you meet certain people that for me really touched me. And I met this one Ukrainian chef. His name is Chef Zenga. Um, he owns like 8 restaurants, whatever. But from the day the war started, he has been trying to reform the Ukrainian military's ability to feed itself. And we could do a whole podcast just on
I bet.
that. It's amazing. And there's so many cultural aspects to a Soviet feeding themselves system where Soviets wanted to, Franklin Taylor scientific method, everything, like just make bread factories just to pump out bread, where you don't have a culture of cooking other than grandmas. How that impacts military capability is really fascinating. But Chef Zenga, I met him in Kyiv, and he's fighting the war every day, like moving to the front. How far would I have to go from Kyiv to get shot at? Literally, it's like 10-hour drives to get to where Russian forces are still trying to do evil things in Ukraine. But I felt it on the day-to-day basis. I felt the war while I was in Kyiv, but the geography, I mean, and again, rockets were landing on Kyiv while I was there last week.
Right.
But the actual, if I want to go see a military formation, which some of the people I traveled with did that, went down to Kherson, but you're talking 8-10 hour drives to get to that front line, what you would consider a front line, right? But with the whole thing with terrorism and launching cruise missiles from the Black Sea, is like you're not in war once you cross the
Right.
border of Ukraine. Literally, you're not. As soon as you cross the border from Poland or wherever you come in from, you feel the war.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah. The danger and the threat, it's always there, right? But like, are people actively shooting each other right in front of your face? You've got to go find that. And so I was always struck by, we would leave, whatever camp or post we were in Iraq, and it's like, I'm amber jamming. Everybody's got a round of the, thing. The rhino is down. All these things. The checklist is long to keep us safe. Drive through our little thing with our up armored Humvee or MRAP. And then there's a mom and a girl just walking, or kids swimming in an irrigation ditch, right? And so you're like, yes, it's dangerous here. It's not permissible, except for there's 4 boys swimming in a ditch, having a great time, just wearing shorts, And so I'm always fascinated by that distance of combat. It's really hard to explain. And like you said, in 30 seconds, something could happen. There could be a bomb just waiting for us, or whatever it's going to be. That distance is crazy.
Yeah, no, and I 100% agree with you. And when I give my presentations about urban combat, I always talk to about permissive environments and non-permissive environments. Like we grew up in the last 20 years with most of the environments after 2003 were permissive, as in there's a very small enemy force. Although some of the villages, and I know you know this, so you go into some villages or like that whole village is against you.
Yeah.
But there is an aspect of permissive and non-permissive environments where permissive environments, we try to identify where the enemy is and move to that enemy. And most of the environment is safe outside of that threat. Versus you go to a city like Bakhmut today, it's mostly non-permissive, as in there's a giant enemy force in the city with you, but there are also thousands of civilians still living in basements of their houses. And you still see grandma walking down the street, or grandpa, as there's a giant firefight happening. It is modern warfare. And you and I have talked to this so many times, that if you're doing military training, Pete, and I know this is preaching to the choir, you're doing any military training, I don't care what it is, where it is, and you don't have civilians present, it isn't realistic.
Yeah. We were in a place and a firefight broke out. I still got my job to do, so I'm still talking to this dude. He's giving me great information, and we're talking. And I'm going to come back probably in a couple of days, and so I need to know people in this area. And so we just kind of scooched back a couple of feet, and I mean a couple of feet, and we weren't on the alleyway, but we were in a spot where bullets were landing on the building that we were like talking. There were 2 buildings, and bullets were hitting one side. And it never occurred to me that because I'm just doing my job and that dude was just doing his job. I think back down, I'm like, damn, anything could have happened. Someone could have scooched over a little bit and shot down me. Never occurred to me, right? So even within a firefight, and it wasn't a long firefight, but it's a firefight, and there's people shooting, and bits of concrete did hit my face, right, from the bullets, but I was nowhere near the fight, wasn't even worried about
Yeah,
it.
it is, and I think it's really, and this is again why I'm such a big fan of Sebastian Junger's work,
Yeah.
is how do you translate that to somebody who hasn't felt that?
You don't. You don't.
It's so hard.
Yeah.
Even my feeling, like I'm not a journalist. I call myself a researcher, and I like to call myself a storyteller. If I get into a situation now where I feel like I'm back in combat, but I don't have a weapon,
Uh-huh.
it's a very disturbing feeling.
Yeah.
Where, like you, and even as an advisor, I just can't put myself in that. It's really hard for me to put myself back in these environments, and I've been a few times over the last few years
Mm.
and not have a weapon.
Yeah.
Not be because I'm not a part of the
Right.
conflict.
Yeah. Yeah.
Really hard for me, even like there's no fighting going on, but I'm on the battlefield, and
Uh-huh.
I can
Yeah.
it it's so hard to translate that to people who haven't felt it, and how disturbing it is for me to be on the ground and not have a weapon just to be in that environment.
There's definitely a space like in our experience and how we came up as soldiers, and because I've had to experience that a lot more. Even if I had a weapon, right? I have to get by on charm. I can't get into a firefight. There's not enough of us, right? So we're forward projected off the camp, and wherever we're going to be, I've got to reliably go back out. I've got to set meetings. That means I've got to have a schedule, and so I'm exposed in a different way. And I recognized even as an E4, I'm like, oh my gosh, like this can never be about force. And I had to reject all of that. Luckily, I'm still here, but you're right. Unless you are used to that and able to walk around in that way, or you're forced to like somebody's grandma, that is definitely not the normal thing for an infantry guy, right? Like you want to be able to say, yeah, I'm armed and prepared, even if I don't have an offensive intent here. I need to be able to defend, and you don't have it.
Yeah, and I've been in some places where the like, what's your plan? What's your evacuation plan?
Yeah,
Where other people hire security, right? A journalist might hire security. Like usually, I don't have. It's a very complex, amazing dream job, and again, to be
yeah,
able to get the access, and sometimes I'm very safe, and people are just overstating the threat. But in other situations, I really would like a weapon just as the backup plan to getting myself out of that environment, and
yeah,
it's just not a reality. So uh, it's a unique professions for sure.
yeah, yeah. It is. I don't want to talk about old stuff, so I'm going to talk about new stuff. Okay, because you were just in Ukraine last week. What else did you pick up? What else did you see? How is the war torn level there? Is everything destroyed? What's going on?
No, and I didn't. The first time back in July, I made it out to more of the like all the frontline positions and where all the destruction was. You can still see evidence of it. To include where recent missile strikes have come in and really hit important things in like Kyiv, and people show me now like that's where that there are a couple of famous photos where rockets will come in, very large rockets, and destroy, and then the Ukrainians will rebuild it like literally overnight, and they're really proud of that capability because again, not letting Russia has this terrorism campaign, but it's not working.
Right.
uh, there's absolutely still lots of damage that you can see, lots of barricades and things like that still in place, and they have to be ready for everything. But there's also the beauty of the city, and I actually got to get out and see some of the actual things that are the history of Kyiv that I didn't the first time. And I wanted to go down into the subway too, because most people don't understand when you have a city underneath the city, it's going to really factor in if you think you're going to take that city, like New York City, and not understand that there's multiple cities underground, and how are you going to deal with that? So I spent a lot of time in the underground this time because Kyiv has, a vast metro subway system. They have some of the second deepest subway station in the world, but they
Jeez.
also have catacombs, water tunnels, Soviet nuclear bunkers that were built, that would have all come into play, just didn't. But that's also where they housed. So I wanted to see, like, because there's photos that are really reminiscent of the London 1940s stuff, where you have all these civilians living underground. So I wanted to go down and look at that, and there's still evidence of that, converting the cities underground into the shelter for kids, and there's
Yeah.
babies being born underground, and all of that was happening last year. And I don't want that stuff to be forgotten, even in my research on how that all played into. But you could actually go to Kyiv and not see evidence of war, maybe. Although there's, even the old hedgehog things that were put into the streets to block if the Russians did get farther than they did, because the Russians never got into the actual city.
Mhm.
All that's still there, very clear. Again, you can't escape what's been done, but you also can feel the city is alive and doing very well, and schools, from primary schools to universities to all of it's running.
You're the urban warfare guy, and we've talked about these mega cities and obviously three-dimensional fighting, right? Because you got these buildings that are now, I mean, hundreds of floors high. It's ridiculous. And then, yeah, tunnels aren't getting any shallower and any less in demand. How has this informed your overall knowledge of urban warfare? Getting to actually have this battle lab to go run around in.
Yeah, I mean, immensely, Pete. That's a great,
Yeah.
again, you just knocking these out of the park with the questions. I teach a course in California, um, part of one of the hats I wear, which is a week-long course on planning for major urban operations, whether it's a mega city, or just a really big city that will just be
Yeah.
as complicated as complex. And in this course, we talk all these variables of the three-dimensional aspect, the density, the cultural differences, across the street. By going into a battle lab like Ukraine, it can either validate, minimize, emphasize all the things that we teach in this course, and I can bring, because again, humans want, like, they don't want to just read books or just see figures or listen to the data says. They want to put that in context of this happened yesterday. So going into a battle lab like Kyiv, I can bring that straight back into the professional military education, which is actually multinational. Like, we have so many countries that come to our course and say, look, we'll use vignettes of World War II, of the global war on terrorism, but to be able to go into an active conflict and see things like a skyscrapers, that's hard. But coming from this last trip, I found out, like, okay, that didn't come into play. But what they did do is put industrial level cameras on top of the highest building that could see for thousands of kilometers.
Yeah.
And again, how are you going to hide in the urban environment?
Yeah.
There is an
Yeah.
aspect of using the urban environment to hide, whether you're an insurgent or a military. But if I can put a camera on the highest building, like, you're not hiding. So all this is just enriching my
Yeah.
all those aspects. And then how the underground, like I went to where, and we talk about this, well, I went to where the Ukrainians put their military headquarters in a subway tunnel, because there's no better bomb-proof bunker than hundreds of kilometers underground. But what does that mean for actually running a wire out to where you're going to have a radio tower? Because when you go underground, you lose a lot of things as well when you're protected. So I went to where this time where they put one of their brigade headquarters. So when I come back to teach a course on that, like, are you even thinking about doing that? And if you are, what are the capabilities that you don't have today? Whether
Yeah.
it's the division headquarters, whatever, you can't just go underground and say, okay, now I'm going to talk to all my units. Do you have that capability?
Boy. Yeah. And then when thinking about the defensive side, if they do get into the city, can you entice a battalion commander to try to clear a skyscraper, like make it look like a delicious target, and then just have it? I mean, if you lost a person to floor, you're not going to go very fast. You're going to end up in that building and stuck. And I mean, and if you don't clear it, what happens if you don't? I'm like, it's like so many things you can think about with this urban problem. And you're right, the tunnel, the comms, all of that stuff. And then do you get cut off on purpose by somebody else? It's there are so many variables in that urban environment, especially if it's a mega city like we're talking about.
Yes, and this is where militaries will try to talk themselves out of preparing for the environment. Oh, it's too hard.
Mm,
It's too complex. We'll deal with that when it comes. When I think it should be the starting point. And it actually, if you again, you use the history of what has happened.
yeah,
A lot of people will take people down like to Chinatown in New York City and say, okay, look around. How are you going to operate in this environment? Like, it's too hard. I can't do it. Uh,
yeah,
like, well, let's give you an actual military mission. Let's give you the context of that mission and talk about it. Like, because how one of the things I say is, how do you clear a skyscraper?
yeah,
Tell me why you need to clear a skyscraper.
right.
And
Yeah,
actually, if a military an enemy puts himself in a skyscraper, he's actually constraining himself because now he's very isolated, and I can isolate a skyscraper depending on what the context of the mission is. There's lots of ways to deal with, and not. Yes, you could spend week and send a whole battalion into a single building in a certain megacity trying to clear every room if that's the objective. But there's so many other ways to think about it. And this is where militaries, I find around the world, like, I'll go back to just training in the desert in the woods and train the basics, and I'll apply
yeah.
it to the urban later. Like, no, don't talk yourself out of the mission.
Yeah. You're right too. Like that Chinatown example is great. Like in my world, you walk across the street, you meet a dude who speaks English, and you get to work,
Yeah.
and you figure it out. But you don't try to change anything. You try to figure out what's here, what's possible there. How do I accomplish my boss's mission through their existing means, right? And we don't train like that. We train where we will now give to you the rule of law, stand by for download. And it's like it doesn't work that way, right? And see, because we don't practice that, we don't learn how to work with an interpreter, we don't learn how to ignore a skyscraper, whatever it's going to be. Yeah, we don't have and look, you can always change that doctrine, but it should be strong. We should be trained so you know what when you're going against what the experience tells us, that you're doing it because something's changed or something's different in that environment.
Yeah. I mean, and you and I have talked about this. It's a Western way of thinking to think that we can control an environment.
Yeah.
Uh,
Yeah. You're way better off working within it, what's there. I want to apply this whole thing where, like, the blitzkrieg model seems to be kaput because you can't, how do you blitzkrieg into something when everything is seen and there's so much knowledge and information coming out of that formation, even if it's moving fast? It doesn't seem like that's a viable approach anymore. But maybe it's taken on a different complexity, or maybe it's wearing a different jacket so that it is possible. But it doesn't seem like you can just encircle or drive over the top of an enemy anymore.
it's so,
Yeah,
context.
yeah, yeah.
The Blitzkrieg was a combination of new technologies, the airplane, the radio, and the tank,
Right,
to identify breakthroughs and then applying mass at a critical point, not across an entire front, to break through. And then you don't need to fight a front line. I don't think that principle, we call that the maneuver
right.
approach, is dead at all. But
Okay.
what is further emphasized, especially in the urban terrain, which will put all your concepts to the test, it is the military who can combine the different technologies or
Mm,
capabilities, like tanks, close air support, fires, intelligence, to identify. And now in this very urbanized warfare that we all will fight, no matter what you say, it's the person who can combine all that together. And this is where really one of the lessons from Ukraine is where Russia came up wanting was its ability to synchronize capabilities. It didn't have
Mm,
it had the capabilities, but what it doesn't have, which requires a lot of investment and a lot of training, is to synchronize. You can't just flow in, heavy, tanks and then flow in our infantry and then put some engineers behind that. It's the military, like the Blitzkrieg model proved, that can combine it all to achieve the goal that will defeat the enemy.
yeah.
But we also
Oh
have
man.
this over westernized concept that if the mission always, no matter what the context, is to destroy the other military. Well, that's ridiculous. That's not the history of war.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
the mission could just get somewhere.
I think about Blue Force Tracker and what a game changer that was, and how obsolete and slow that is now, and how if your military structure is too rigid and unable to advance fast, like the Ukrainians have or the Israelis, goodness gracious, the Israelis, man, they don't stand still for a second. And how quickly they are able to develop people that are able to develop those contingency things and go, let me grab this. This is off the shelf. Like before Bosnia, right before Bosnia happened, a couple, I think it was E4s, are like, why don't we just go buy for our world a laptop, whatever that digital camera thing is, this little portable scanner, put it in a suitcase and deploy people. And so, literally, on the eve of the digital age exploding for everybody, especially counterintelligence, it was a couple of E4s. It was some with a checkbook to go buy, I don't know, $5,000 worth of stuff. And it totally changed everything for us. I trained with the pencil and paper writing reports, right? And then deployed 18 months later, and because I knew how to type on a laptop, they're like, can you do that thing? And I could make a printer and a camera and a laptop all talk together and make something come out of the other end. It blew. Can you imagine these generals from Vietnam seeing that? They're like, what in the world? You took a picture today on a patrol and that was what? It blew their minds.
Yeah, so I think you got a really good point there, Pete. Which again, it gets to the hubris of, let's say, the American military system.
Yeah.
Is that we're prepared, we know we have the best equipment. One of the things that the Russians did before the Ukraine war was rotate every senior officer in the Russian military into Syria, as in send them there and observe and gather and try to influence that aspect. How
Yeah.
many active duty U.S. military generals have been into Ukraine? Uh, I think since the war, zero.
Oh man. Yeah.
Uh, because of but what you just described is the Ukrainian military, that ability to just take what they have and combine
Yeah.
it. And I mean, just talk about the drones. And I used to be against, like, oh, drones are the future.
Yeah.
But what the Ukrainian people have done with the drones, not just dropping things on top of Russians, which have been insane, but there's like tens of thousands, like the number of civilian drones that get shipped into Ukraine a day is off the charts. And they're using them from every, like you said, because they don't have any bureaucratic things that stop innovation. And
Yeah.
that's the issue. And I know why our system is so bureaucratic, because of waste, fraud, and abuse, and like all these things. But that ability, like you said, the Israelis and now the Ukrainians,
Yeah.
that's a superpower. Like, that's a military
Yeah.
capability in of itself. And the less people we have who are actually on the ground seeing this from, like, because you go out with a unit, like, you can understand things in a division, in a Pentagon or
Yeah.
whatever, in this briefing that's been, you got to get on the ground and see
Oh,
it,
you do.
and then go up to the command in the country and see how that's influencing the picture and the decisions and all
Yeah.
this. I think we're actually, from our own, judging ourselves, is we're missing out a lot on what's happening in Ukraine.
One of my favorite questions to ask a new commander, either I'm gaining or they're gaining me, was what keeps you up at night and what's the next thing? And those two things were so far apart from each other. It's like I'm worried about rocket propelled V bids flying into okay, great. And then what else? I don't know if we can train these police. Wow, those are different problems, and you have to learn that by being on the ground, learn how to ask those questions of a commander, so you can say, this is what's on this person's mind, and this is the problem they can't solve. And for a guy like me, like, I can help you understand these problems better. I can show you where you're winning and losing, but you have to be able to develop that capacity in a lot of people to be able to do that across all the different spectrum of things you have to master and dominate to win a fight.
Absolutely.
Anything else in closing, man, before I go? Anything hit you hard when you were there?
I mean, the people, all the human stories always hit me, but these people like that chef who's literally trying to change an entire military's approach to preparing and serving food was what I was not prepared. And this is why you go there. Like,
Yeah,
I go there with this list of people I want to meet with, and but like, hey, but you should talk to this guy. And
right.
and then I just have these mind blowing moments that I couldn't have prepared for at all.
I love it. I love it.
Yeah.
Hey, man, listen, it's always fun to have you on. If you got anything else, otherwise, I'm going to run the credits here.
No, thanks, Pete. Always a pleasure.
Yeah, that was fantastic. Stand by. Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly.